Welcome to Stand Firm Ministries, bringing you hope and inspiration through the timeless truths of the Bible. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Pastor Nat Crawford, President of Stand Firm Ministries and lead pastor of Living Life Church in Nebraska. Does God care about your life? Does He care about your decisions? Can your hopeless situation turn around? These are questions we all wrestle with from time to time. I've been there myself, wondering, God, are you there? Do you really care about me? Or even thinking, God, I know you care, but I got myself into this mess. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that God is faithful, regardless of our decisions or circumstances. And that's why we're going to dive into the book of Ruth today. Get ready to explore the life-changing lessons of faith, hope, and God's unwavering love. Now, let's join Pastor Nat Crawford as he leads us through Ruth chapter 1.
Well, what do you think? Does God care about your life? Is God aware of your circumstances? Does God really care about the decisions that you make? What about those moments that seem to be hopeless? Those hopeless situations that we experience from time to time. Does God care about those moments? Can God do anything with those situations? I think we all wrestle with those questions from time to time. I mean, I know I have. I get into a situation or a circumstance and I go, God, are you there? God, are you aware of what's happening to me today? God, I'm in a hopeless situation. What are you going to do about this to help me out? Do you even care? But then we also have those moments in life where we realize God isn't the one who created the situation. Instead, we're the ones. We've made decisions. And now we wrestle with the question, wait, should God do something about this? Or I made my bed, therefore I should sleep in it. Does God care? If there's one thing I've learned by studying the Bible, if there's one thing I've learned through my experience of walking with God, is that God is faithful, regardless of the circumstances or my decisions. And that's why we want to study the book of Ruth. So today we're kicking off a 4-week sermon series on the book of Ruth called Hope in a Hopeless Situation. So if you have your Bible, turn with me to the book of Ruth. If you don't know where the book of Ruth is, that's okay. I had to look it up as well. It's in the Old Testament, and it's the 8th book of the Old Testament. It's interesting. In the Bible, there are only 2 books named after women, Ruth and Esther. You will not find Ruth's name anywhere else in the Old Testament, but you do find Ruth in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 1, and it's in connection to the lineage of Jesus Christ. So who wrote the book of Ruth? Well, that's and it's generally understood that the prophet Samuel wrote the book of Samuel probably around 1000 BC. One of the neat conversation points of the book of Ruth is that many commentators and even scholars will say that the book of Ruth is one of the most loveliest books ever written in short form. They say what the Mona Lisa is to a painting, that's what the book of Ruth is to literature. Now, the story of Ruth takes time during the Judges, the period of the Judges. And as you can see from the map, that this takes place in the land of Bethlehem as well as in the land of Moab. What's interesting about the context of the situation is Moab was the ongoing enemy of Israel and Judah. It didn't matter what was happening. It seems like there was constant turmoil. Moab was east of the Dead Sea. It was a distant, quite a distance, about 50 miles away from Bethlehem. Moab actually came about after Lot would have sex with his daughter back in Genesis chapter 19. Not a great start to a life. But this would create tension, and this would cause enmity between Israel and God's chosen people and the people of Moab. In Numbers 22 through 25, we see that Balak, the king of Moab, is opposed to Israel and is going to make the life of the Jews very hard. For 18 years, Moab would oppress Israel. But Saul eventually would defeat the Moabites in 1 Samuel chapter 14, and David would eventually have peace with them. Again, Ruth would happen during the time of the Judges. So this covered a span of around 300 years or so, around 1300 BC to about 1000 BC. So what we're going to see here, it's really a bridge between the time of the Judges and the time of Israel's monarchy. So now, understanding the complex situation of the book of Ruth, let's pick it up in Ruth chapter 1, and we'll pick it up in verses 1 through 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So the book of Ruth opens with a problem. There is famine in the land. And what makes this just a little bit ironic is that they are in Bethlehem. Bethlehem means house of bread. And yet we find that there is famine in the land. The pantry should be full, but what do they find? It's actually empty. So this insignificant little town, it's the house of bread, and the whole country, they are without resources. But what we really begin to understand is this famine is both literal, but it's also spiritual. Yes, it is literal. There is famine. The crops are not producing. The rains have not come for some time, and so there is no bread in the cupboard. But it's also spiritual. Remember, this was written during the time of the Judges. The theme of the book of Judges, the recurring thing you hear over and over again, is that the people did what was right in their own eyes. They would play God for themselves, and there was no king. It was a mess. So there was both literal famine for the people, but there was spiritual famine as well. But the famine is real. And so what does Elimelech and his family do? They decide to leave the house of bread, which is now empty, and they go to sojourn in Moab. Sojourn means to be a traveler as someone, as an alien. They're not from the land, and they're there to live and to work. So it's to be a stranger or an alien in a foreign place. It's the best thing I can think of. As Husker fans, we decide that life in Nebraska is hard. There's famine in the land, and we go to work in Iowa. We don't want to be there. We don't want to be with those Iowa fans, but desperate times call for desperate measures. And so they realize that. So Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons, they leave Bethlehem, and they go and traverse to Moab. As I said before, Moab was around 50 miles away from Bethlehem. And on foot, this was about a 7 to 10 day journey when they're going through the mountains. It was a hard trek, and so they would have taken around 7 or 10 days to get from Bethlehem to Moab. What's interesting is, like many of us, we seem to think the grass will always be greener on the other side. And so they go to Moab thinking that if I go there, I'll have all the bread I need and life will be great. There is hope. in a hopeless situation. But instead of finding hope, what do they find? Death. One of the things we have to remember about the Bible is that everything is there on purpose and for a purpose. And when someone was named in the Bible, they were named intentionally. So Naomi, a character we will follow throughout the whole book, her name means sweet or pleasant. And I want you to keep that in mind as we work our way through this chapter today. Naomi means sweet or pleasant. Now, Elimelech, his name means my God is king. Now, if you turn back just a page to the end of Judges, think about what it says. Judges 21:25 says this: in those days, there was no king in Israel. There was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The verse right before we turn the page and get into the book of Ruth, that's how it ends. There is no king in Israel. And then who do we find? Elimelech. Elimelech's name means my God is king. So Elimelech recognized who God was, the sovereign ruler and the one in charge. So he trusts God, and yet he feels the inclination to uproot his family and sojourn in Moab. Seems like a good move, right? Well, we know that that wasn't a good move, because what happens? Elimelech dies. This is tragic. It's not what they had expected. It's not what they wanted. So not only is there famine of food when they leave, but now they come to Moab expecting hope, and now it's a famine of hope. If things weren't bad enough, their two sons died. Again, names have meanings in the Bible, and they have meaning today. Malin meant to be ill. It meant to be sick. And Chilion meant destruction. His name meant to come to an end, so they should have probably known once they realized who they were, things were not going to end very well for them. So Naomi, she is far from home, she has no husband, and she has no sons. But if you notice in verses 3 and 4, her sons did marry. Verses 3 through 4 says, she was left with her two sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. So after Elimelech dies, her children marry, and they would marry these two women. What's interesting is in the original language, the word marry here actually has the overtone of being taken by force. It's not like these men went out and courted these women. They went on a dating show, and it seemed to work out by the people's votes. They saw the women, and they took them for themselves. And what's the result? I believe it's more famine, because look at what it says. It says, 10 years go by after being married, and they have no children. Famine of bread, famine of hope, and now a famine of the womb. So in the midst of the tragedy, Naomi has inherited two daughters-in-law. But what on earth will she do with them? What should she do at this moment? I mean, it seems to be a hopeless situation. Well, let's look beginning in verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. In the face of great tragedy and in the face of a hopeless situation, she receives a message of hope from God. God says, I will provide you with food. The Hebrew literally reads, given them bread. Again, remember, Bethlehem, the house of bread, became empty, and that's why they left. But now God has restocked the shelves, and the pantry is becoming full again. We begin to see God's hand, and we begin to see God's grace unfold in several ways. First, there's good news. Remember, we as Christians, we as the people of God, we recognize God's grace is good news to a fallen world. So in a world for Naomi that was broken and hopeless, there became good news. There is opportunity to restore. But also notice that there's an intervention here. We begin to see God intervening for his people, because the text reads, the Lord had visited his people and given them bread. The word visited here has a few different meanings or contexts that it's usually used in. It's used in the context of a military. It means that people assemble. It means to gather. It means to muster. But also there's a theological context for the word visited. On the negative side, it means that God will visit a people when they have been rebellious. It means he is coming to deal discipline out to his people when they've violated the covenants, when they have said, God, I don't want to live by your rules. I'm going to do it my way. So negatively, it means that God will come and visit them to deal discipline. But on the positive side, it means God is intervening. He is going to show grace upon grace. He is going to bless his people. Don't miss that here also it says his people. This signifies God's chosen people, Israel, the Jews. God has chosen them, and he has a plan for them, and he will not abandon them even when they are most rebellious. So here he is rejuvenating the land with rain. The cupboards are becoming full again. He is visiting, intervening for his people. And then we see that bread, the bread by God, the Lord, Yahweh. He is restoring the land. He is restoring his people. He is restoring what was once full. God's grace is on display here for his people and for Naomi and for the land. So what do? They get up. As soon as they receive word that God is intervening, the cupboards are full, Bethlehem really is the house of bread again, they immediately get up and they take off running. They don't finish the game of Scrabble. Now, I want you to think about that. What do we do when we hear of God's blessing? We linger. We sit around. We spend as much time as we can doing whatever we're doing, and then when it's convenient for us, we get moving again. But that's not what these three women do. And notice in verse 8, as they're walking, what does Naomi say? She says, stop. She says, you girls, you go back to your mothers. Now, why would she do this? It's because these were Moabite women, enemies of Judah. For them to come back with Naomi would have meant a very hard life. Already for Naomi, she was going back as a widow. She was going to have to face hardship and resting on the kindness of others and ultimately relying on God. But she knew for these Moabite women, it's going to be really hard. If it's hard for me, multiply it. They don't like you. They're not going to like you. It's better that you go back and stay home with your mothers and get remarried. What I think we're seeing here is really a scene of tough love. And then at the end of verses 8 and through 9, what does she do? She prays for them. She prays, may the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. What is she praying? She is praying that God will deal kindly with them. It's a Hebrew word, hesed. And this is a complex Hebrew word that we really can't translate accurately. There is no English word that can can make up the richness of this Hebrew word, because what we often do is we translate it as God's loving kindness. But what we're really talking about here is the overwhelming love of God, that deeply emotional love of God, that deeply rich grace and mercy and benevolence and provision and care. There is no English word that can possibly communicate how deep and rich of a word this is. But we just have to understand this is God's loving kindness, grace upon grace, mercy and love and kindness. So Naomi's prayer is that these girls, that God has said would be expressed to them and that they would receive it. What we see here is that this love and this loving kindness is really threefold. It's a prayer for God's grace to be experienced by all people. It's a prayer that these girls would receive this kindness, God's overwhelming love, and that also that they would understand the richness and the depth of this kindness. God is aware of your circumstance. God does know the hopeless moment that you're in, or that you've been in, or you will be in. But as we will see bit by bit through the story, and we're seeing it here now, God is in control. God is sovereign, and He is aware of your great trouble and your heartache. In the midst of the pain and the despair, God is there. And so is His hesed, His loving kindness. Well, the girls receive it, and apparently they reciprocate it, because in verses 9 through 10 it says, "Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept, and they said to her, 'No, no, we will return with you to your people.'" This is a deeply emotional scene. They're at a crossroads. What's going to happen? They are in a tough situation. Do they go back with Naomi and face hardship and struggle? Or do they go back to their mothers, stay in the land, and stay with their gods? Well, what do? They cry. And they express, "No, Naomi, we will go with you. We will return with you to your people." They're reciprocating that loving kindness that Naomi has passed on from God to them. And they're saying, "No, we will be with you." Verse 11, "But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, no, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.' Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her." Kind of fascinating, isn't it? Almost humorous. In verses 11 and 12, Naomi doesn't give just a kind response. She gives a sarcastic response. She says, "Look at me. I'm old. You think I'm going to get pregnant? I don't even have a husband. And even if I was married, and even if I was going to have a baby, I'm going to have two. If I'm going to have two, you're going to have to wait for these boys to grow up. Are you really going to stick around and expect that to happen?" She's quite sarcastic in her answer to these women. So what's her point? No, this isn't a good situation for you. Stay here. Stay with your people. Find a husband here. Go back to your gods and do your thing. Let's be honest, this is the logical thing to do. If someone came into your house and said, what do I do with my situation? You're going to say, do the thing that makes the most amount of sense. And that's exactly what Naomi does here. But then in verse 13, what we see is a troubling picture of Naomi, but it's an honest picture of Naomi and what's going into her heart. She says in verse 13, it is exceedingly better to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. On one hand, we see here that Naomi recognized that God is sovereign. He is God and he is in control. But on the other hand, she sees her situation and says, it's not my fault, it's God's fault. God is out to get me. You don't want to be with me. And so Naomi has changed. She left Bethlehem as pleasant, as sweet, but now she's turned out to be a bitter old woman who blames God for her situation. Just like the story of Job, life has fallen apart. Life is not as we expected. Job has lost virtually everything. And Job's wife says, why don't you just curse God and die? God's the problem. So she's playing both parts in the story. A little bit of Job, recognizing God's sovereignty, but also blaming him for the situation. So she says, look, girls, I am no good for you. Stay here and be with your people. Just stay away from me. Then verse 14 says, then they lifted up their voices and they wept again. Deeply emotional, a crossroads. And so what happens? It says, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Again, they're in a moment of great turmoil and sadness. They're weeping. They're mourning. They're processing. They don't know what to do. But each girl will have to decide for themselves. What will Orpah do? What will Ruth do? Well, it says that Orpah kisses Naomi. That tells us she's going to stay in Moab. She'll go back to her people, she'll go back to her mother, and she will go back to her God. Now, there's no commentary whether this is the right choice or the wrong choice. It just is what makes sense for her. But notice what Ruth does. Ruth clings to Naomi. That tells us she is going with Naomi no matter where she goes. We begin to see a glimpse of the faith and the courage of this Moabite woman. As you guys know, I love musicals, and one of my favorite musicals is Fiddler on the Roof. And in that musical, there's a song that Tevye's daughter sings, Huddle, and it's called Far From the Home I Love. She's at a crossroads. Her fiancé is in a prison in Siberia, and she wants to go and be with him. Yet, she wants to be with her family, with her papa. And so she sings, there where my heart has settled long ago, I must go. I must go. Who could imagine I'd be wandering so far from the home I love? Yet, there with my love, I'm home. This is that moment for Ruth. Does she leave her people, her gods, her family, or does she go with Naomi? And it would appear that with Naomi, Ruth, though far from home, she is home. We're beginning to see that Naomi was right. God is in control, but unlike Naomi, Ruth understands that there is no reason to be bitter to God. His loving kindness is everywhere. So will this be the right decision? Verses 15 through 18. And she said, see, Your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no. So Orpah, she says, "I'm staying here. You're right. It's better for me to stay with my people. It's going to be a hard life, but there is much more hope here for me than to go with you." But Ruth says, "No, I'm clinging to you. I'm not going to leave you." But what does Naomi say to Ruth? She says, "Don't you get it? Orpah understands. What's wrong with you? She's going to be with her people. She's going to be with her mother. She's going to find a new husband. She is going to be with her culture and her religion. This makes sense for her. Go, Ruth. Do the same." This is a sober moment and a sober declaration, both because we see the relational impact, but we also see the theological perspective of Naomi. So notice that Naomi, though bitter, she recognizes, hey, I may as well just go back to my people, go back to Bethlehem, and then I'll go back and be with God. The word return here can actually be translated as repent. There is a changing of the mind, a beginning of a shift in her thinking. We see this in Psalm 19, verse 7. There it says, "The law of the Lord is perfect." And we usually say reviving the soul, but it's actually repenting of the soul, turning of the soul, changing of the mind. And that's what we see happening here. We see with Orpah, because Orpah is actually repenting of her hesed, her loving kindness to Naomi, and she goes back home to her people and to her gods. But Ruth, she's not going to have it. Ruth says, "No, I want you to listen to me. God's loving kindness, your loving kindness, I will deliver it back to you. I'm going with you no matter what. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay." She is committing to loving and caring for Naomi. This is very truly not your typical mother-in-law, daughter-in-law story, right? But Ruth declares, your people, they're now going to be my people. Your God is going to now be my God. There's a lot of debate if this was the conversion moment for Ruth or not. Frankly, I don't think it really matters. She may have just been simply reciprocating what she received from Naomi and giving it back to her in kind. But regardless, Ruth is committing to going to being with Naomi until death separates them. So Naomi is aware that Ruth is in this for life. And so she says, fine, I'm done. I'm not going to convince you anymore. Let's go back. So what will their arrival be like back in Bethlehem? Verses 19 through 22. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So they leave for Bethlehem from Moab. It's been another 7 to 10 days, a hard trek through the mountains. But finally, they're in Bethlehem. And it's been 10 years since Naomi left Moab. Now, her return was unexpected, but I can promise you it was not uninformed. There is no doubt that the tragedies that have fallen upon Naomi and her family have traveled back to Bethlehem. So they see her walking down the street, and what does the text say? It says that the town was stirred. Now, the word stirred has a wide range of meanings, but I think it's pretty safe to say that this was the talk of the town. This was the gossip moment that everyone had been wondering if it would finally come true, and it has. So Naomi shows up with her daughter-in-law, Ruth, and people are talking. Well, why is this such a big deal? First of all, she came back. She didn't stick it out there any longer. It's been 10 years, but she's back. But I think the real reason for the talking is how much that time and tragedy had transformed Naomi. I think this is very clear in her response in verses 20 through 21, because she says, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." I mean, why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Remember, Naomi means sweet. It means pleasant one. But she's changed. She is not the same person. The townspeople, they see her. They recognize her, but they're not believing what they're seeing. It's as if they see this old, haggard woman with a scowl on her face coming down the road with this young woman behind her. And they realize, I think that is Naomi. And what does she say? Yes, it's me. I left pleasant. I left sweet. I left with hope in my heart, but I've come back bitter. That's why she says, call me Mara. That's what it means. It means bitter. Let's face it, pain and time and tragedy can age a person. So she's had a rough. I mean, she's lost her husband. She's lost her sons. She was a sojourner, someone who was an exile or a stranger in a strange land, an alien. So she's experienced all this famine, all these different kinds of famine. And so she went to Moab young. She went to Moab healthy, but she comes back old and frail and bitter towards God. And we know that she blames God for her situation. She says, this is God's fault. He has dealt bitterly with me. But don't miss the fact that she calls God the Lord. This is Yahweh, God's proper name. He is God. There is no one like God. She sees God and she says, you are God. And yet she blames him for his circumstance. But notice that she also calls him the Almighty. This is Shaddai. And Shaddai is both a name of God, but it's really a title for God. It means the one who was on top of the mountain. It means the one who is in charge of God, of the heavenly armies. So Naomi, she recognizes this is God. He is the one who's in charge. He is the Almighty, the one who has control over everything and over heaven's armies. But it changes her perspective on what that means. She says, because he's in control, he is the one who has done this to me. But then in verse 22, we see a moment of sovereign serendipity. It says, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. That tells us that they showed up at the right time. They're at the right place, because the time of the barley harvest was in March and April. This was the beginning of when things would finally start to become harvested, and the grain bins would be full, and the pantries were going to be stocked for the foreseeable future. There was not a better time for Naomi and Ruth to appear on the scene. This is God's sovereign hand. This isn't luck. This isn't chance. This is God displaying to Naomi and Ruth, I am Yahweh. I am El Shaddai. I am the Almighty. I am in control. The reality is, friends, we all face seasons of famine. We all face seasons of doubt. We all have moments of hopelessness. We all experience those crossroads of faith moments. We do wrestle. We do ask the question, God, where are you? I thought I was acting faithfully, and I followed, and I went to where I thought I should be, and yet here I am. I am bitter. I am broken. I am hopeless. We have to remember that God is still in control, even in the most out-of-control, seemingly circumstances. When we studied the book of James, we know that we will experience trials of various kinds, big trials, small trials. We'll experience trials that we never saw coming and never wanted to experience. Jesus said, you will have trouble. It's going to happen. Jesus in Matthew 5 reminds us that good things happen to the bad people and bad things happen to good people. That's just the way of the world. And yet, God is not off of his throne. God is still aware of you and your situation, just like he was aware of Naomi's and Ruth's situation. You may be in a season of famine, and 10 years may seem like a cakewalk to you. You'd be like, I would take 10 years in a moment to get out of this season of famine. But I want you to know, and as we begin to see from this text today, God is in control. He is Yahweh, God, the God. He is El Shaddai. He is the Almighty. He has everything in his control. He knows what's going on. Nothing is out of his sight or out of his control. We've also had those moments in our journey where we get to those moments and we say, whoa, God, you are here. I thought you had abandoned me, but you become to be in the right place at the right time for a moment like this. You begin to see God's hand of provision and his care for you, much like we're seeing here today. I promise you, even in the worst of circumstances, even in the most hopeless of situations and circumstances, God can and will work together those moments for his glory, but also for your blessing. We need to be willing to be like Ruth, who sees his loving kindness, to see his hesed, and then to receive it, and then to pass it on to the people around us. We all have those crossroads moments, but we have to always look back at God as the one in control. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. I don't know what you're going through today. I don't know what hopeless situation you're facing or you will face. But know this, God has a plan. He has a purpose. His loving kindness is all around you. He is the God, and he is in control. Why on earth would we ever doubt him? Let's pray. Father, You are God. You are the Almighty. We can trust you in all circumstances. Father, I truly don't know what each person in this room and watching online is facing today. But the famines are very real. They may not take place like in the land of Judah, but it may be a famine of hope, a famine of love, a famine of provision, a famine of promises kept. But you are aware of every one of those. God, I pray that from today's word, from the book of Ruth, that we will truly know and see your loving kindness, that we will know and trust you, that we will focus our eyes on you and you alone, not the circumstances and not the people. God, we don't know exactly how this story is going to play out in the end, but one thing we can be sure of is that you are faithful, regardless of our faithfulness. So, Father, may we have hope in you. May we find our strength, our value, our purpose, and our meaning all in you. God, we as your people, we as Living Life Church, may we come together to strengthen each other and to be agents of truth and agents of hope in a hopeless world. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
You've been listening to Stand Firm Ministries with Pastor Nat Crawford, bringing you insights from the book of Ruth. Friends, whatever your situation, remember that God's faithfulness never wavers. Just as He provided for Naomi and Ruth in their darkest times, He is with you in yours. Look for His loving kindness and trust in His plan. Your hopeless situation can turn around through your faith in God.
Thank you for joining us today. If you were inspired by this message, be sure to subscribe to Pastor Nat's channel for more uplifting teachings.
And don't forget to like and share this episode so others can find hope too. Together, let's spread the message of God's unfailing love.
Until next time, stand firm in your faith and stand on God's word.